Today, on this episode of How to Become a Scientist, this web episode will explain the scientific method. Today, I'll explain it by doing an experiment of my own involving basketball. I'm wondering if the inflation rate of a basketball will actually affect the player and if the player will be able to notice. But first, before we can do any of this, we have to know how the scientific method works and the steps to the scientific method. Okay, now let's take a closer look at the scientific method. First step in any science procedure would be to question or to ask a question for what you're going to be testing. You need to have a question. In our case, it will be that if the inflation of a basketball will affect the player, or if the player will know the difference. Next, we will make a hypothesis. We will guess what is going to happen and why we think that. I think that a player will easily tell the difference in inflation because it will make gameplay easier or harder for that player. Third, we follow a procedure in which we will test the question at hand and find answers. By this, we will run a test including variables, and that will help us to do the fourth step, which is collect data. Once the data is collected, we can move on to the last part, which is making conclusions and seeing if your hypothesis was correct or not. This is a simple way of doing the scientific method. Now, let's take a look on how we should do this. Okay, now on to the data collecting phase and the procedure. In this procedure, I have now deflated the Advantage Wilson ball, in which it is under 3 psi lower than the Wilson NCAA competition ball. This will help us to control those variables. Now, the next step is the fun part, handing these balls to a few players and getting their opinions on which one has more air in it. This procedure requires that the participants do not know which ball is which, and also that you have measured correctly which ball has less air in it. This step of the scientific method, the procedure, is often the part most messed up on and needs to be paid careful attention to get the variables right. After we collect data, we will make a conclusion and see what happens. After collecting all of the samples that we took from our players about which ball had more air in it, whether it was the actual inflated ball or the deflated ball, we can come to the conclusion that it really does matter if a ball is inflated properly for a player to play correctly. This is the last step in the scientific method, being able to make conclusions and see if your hypothesis was correct or incorrect. If you can't come up with these based on your data, then something's wrong with your procedure and you must do it again. But this is usually where people come to find out whether their questions can be answered or not by this experiment that they have done. This is the final slide in this web episode of How to Become a Scientist.